The Royal Guard fell asleep before the plane even left the gate. Eyes closed in seat 12. Like nothing could touch him. Passengers stared. To the Navy SEALs a few rows ahead, it was comedy. "Guy thinks he's on parade," they muttered. But halfway over the Atlantic, the sky changed. A violent jolt, oxygen masks dropped, smoke curled from the ceiling, and the pilot collapsed at the controls. Panic swept through the cabin. The SEALs looked at each other, but none of them moved. Then the cockpit door burst open. "I need a pilot, now!" the captain shouted, and that's when the man in red opened his eyes. Now, before we show you what happened when that Royal Guard walked into the cockpit, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The gate at JFK had that familiar airport buzz. Travellers shuffling forward, boarding passes getting scanned, overhead announcements nobody really listens to. Just another transatlantic red-eye to London. Flight 209, nothing special. Until he walked down the jet bridge. You know how sometimes a person just commands attention without trying? That was Corporal Thomas Ward. 6 feet of Coldstream Guard in full ceremonial dress, and there was literally nowhere to hide on a commercial airliner. Scarlet tunic that looked like it had been pressed with a steam iron and a prayer. Black trousers with a crease sharp enough to cut paper. Boots so polished they could double as mirrors. He carried a military garment bag over one shoulder, and under his arm was this tall oval case that screamed bearskin hat. The kind of thing that makes American tourists whip out their phones. Because, let's face it, you don't see that every day at 30,000 feet. Walking down that aisle, Ward had perfect posture, not the stiff, show-off kind, just solid, like he'd been born standing at attention. A few passengers nodded respectfully, others stared, but one group wasn't impressed at all. Rows 9 through 11 belonged to 6 Americans who were clearly military. Broad shoulders, confident grins, and that particular brand of loudness that comes with thinking you own every room you walk into. Navy SEALs, judging by the faded trident tattoos, peeking out from under their t-shirt sleeves, and the way they carried themselves like walking recruiting posters. The guy leading their little comedy show was Brant, mid-30s, sunburned, with eyes that had seen some serious action and found half of it hilarious. He nudged his buddy and nodded toward Ward. "Look at this guy. Did Disney World lose their mascot or what?" Another one snorted. "Maybe he's advertising for the next James Bond movie. You know, fancy tea service at cruising altitude." The laughter rippled just loud enough to be heard 3 rows back. Not quite offensive enough to call out, but definitely intended to sting. Ward didn't even blink, just kept walking with that same measured pace until he reached 12A window seat. He stored his bearskin case like he was handling museum pieces, slid the garment bag on top, and sat down in one fluid motion. No fumbling with the overhead bin, no checking his phone. Just sat, adjusted his posture once and closed his eyes. Before the plane even finished taxiing, he was perfectly still. "Guy's already asleep," Brant's voice drifted back. "We haven't even hit altitude." "Probably worn out from all that saluting," came the response. But Ward didn't twitch, didn't flinch. His hands rested in his lap, fingers laced, breathing steady and even. To everyone watching, it looked like the deepest sleep imaginable. But here's what they didn't know about Corporal Thomas Ward. 12 years ago, he wasn't wearing a ceremonial uniform. He was crouched behind a half-destroyed mud wall in Helmand province, blood soaking through a field bandage wrapped around his left hand. The sky was full of dust and gunship noise, and the Chinook they'd been riding in was twisted metal and dying engines. Then Sergeant Ward pressed a headset to his ear, static crackling as he shouted over the chaos. Pilots unconscious, co-pilots not breathing. Corporal Jackson was slumped next to him, eyes already going glassy. They'd been 8 men on that bird. Now they were down to 2 with pulses. Ward dropped his rifle, wiped grit from his eyes and hauled himself into that cockpit. He'd never actually flown a Chinook before, not officially, but he'd sat behind enough pilots during medevacs, watched enough hands work the controls, learned to feel what machines were trying to tell you when words weren't enough. He didn't pray, Didn't think about dying. He just grabbed the stick, kept the horizon where it belonged, and trusted 26 years of life to get him through the next 26 minutes. The burning helicopter limped across the wire at FOB Thorpe, with one side shredded and the other barely holding together. The black box never recorded what happened in that cockpit. Ward never filed a report. The medal they tried to give him sat unsigned in some Whitehall filing cabinet. When they asked him why he wouldn't talk to the press, wouldn't let them make him a hero, he just said, "Wasn't my job to crash pretty. Was my job to bring the others home." He never mentioned it again. When the hearing damage got worse and the shrapnel in his hand started locking up during combat drill, he requested ceremonial duty. Coldstream Guards, Buckingham Palace, where silence was respected and stillness had power. Now, sitting in 12A with his eyes closed, Ward looked like nothing more than an ornamental soldier catching up on sleep. But that left eye cracked open just slightly when the overhead light flickered. Just once, most people missed it. He tilted his head barely an inch, listening to something deeper than the engine drone. A faint irregularity in the right turbine. Not enough to panic about, not yet, but enough for someone who knew what to listen for. He exhaled slowly and closed his eye again. The uniform they were mocking covered skin marked with shrapnel scars. And tucked inside his bearskin case was a photo of 8 men from Helmand, only one still breathing. Thomas Ward had earned every second of his silence, but silence didn't mean unprepared. The cabin lights had dimmed to that soft amber glow that makes everyone look like they're in a movie. Dinner service was winding down, trays clattering as flight attendants rolled carts back toward the galley. Most passengers were settling into that long-haul rhythm, pillows inflated, screens glowing, the gentle hum of people trying to sleep their way across the Atlantic. In row 12, Ward hadn't moved a muscle, still upright, still perfectly composed, still looking for all the world, like he was dead to the world. But 3 rows forward, the volume was definitely not dropping with altitude. The Navy SEALs had discovered the in-flight whiskey, and with it, their inside voices had apparently gone overboard somewhere over Newfoundland. "I still can't believe they let the Queen's personal doorman fly coach with the rest of us," Brant was saying, swirling bourbon in his plastic cup like he was at some high-end bar instead of crammed into economy class. The laughter spread around his little circle. One of his buddies leaned into the aisle, craning his neck to get a look at Ward. "Still out cold. That fancy uniform probably has built-in sleep mode." "Built-in pose mode, you mean?" Another one chimed in. "Standing around in London while tourists take selfies. Real demanding career path." "Bet he couldn't hold a rifle without those white gloves on," Brant added, tapping his fingers against his cup. "Those parade ground guys, they melt if it drizzles." More chuckling, sharp enough now that the businessman in 14D glanced over with obvious annoyance. A flight attendant paused near their row, her professional smile looking a little strained as she assessed the situation, then kept moving. "Can you imagine that guy in actual combat?" Someone stage whispered. "Excuse me, could you please cease fire? You're wrinkling the tunic." That got another round of laughs, but the edge was getting meaner. Not just guys blowing off steam anymore. This was the kind of casual cruelty that comes from assuming your experience is the only one that matters. Brant leaned back, fixing his gaze on the red uniform just visible a few rows behind. "I swear, if that guy gets up to stretch and pulls out a tea service, I'm writing a letter to the Queen myself." Nothing but silence from row 12. Ward didn't shift, didn't twitch, didn't give them the satisfaction of even acknowledging their existence. From the outside, you'd think he was sleeping through the whole thing, but he was cataloguing every word, reading the pattern of voices, the tone shifts, the building tension. Combat had taught him that arrogance often came right before chaos. And somewhere beneath the steady drone of the engines, there was a vibration tickling through the floor that didn't belong. Something subtle but wrong. Something that made his left eye crack open in the darkness. The first jolt hit like someone had kicked the plane from underneath. Hard enough to rattle coffee cups and make that sleeping baby 3 rows up shriek like a smoke alarm. Then came the pop. Not loud, but unmistakable, mechanical. Somewhere behind the left wing, something had just given up. Overhead, bins started snapping open on their own. Luggage shifted with ominous thuds. Someone gasped, then someone else, and then the sound spread like wildfire. The oxygen masks dropped. All of them, all at once, yellow plastic tentacles dangling from the ceiling, like the plane was sprouting jellyfish. The cabin lights flickered twice, held for a heartbeat, then flickered again. A scream erupted from somewhere in the back, then another. Flight attendants materialized in the aisles with wide eyes, and voices pitched just a little too high to be reassuring. "Please, remain seated. Place your masks over your nose and mouth." But nobody was listening, because nobody stays calm when the thing that's supposed to keep them alive suddenly starts falling apart around them. A toddler was wailing somewhere. A man fumbled his phone while grabbing for his mask. Someone was shouting in Spanish from the back of the plane, and threading through it all was a smell that made your throat close up. Burnt electronics, hot metal, something cooking that wasn't supposed to be. Up in first class, the curtain flew open, and a woman in a business suit stumbled into the aisle, her hand pressed to her chest. "He collapsed!" she cried, loud enough to carry over the chaos. "The pilot! He just fell forward!" That's when panic went from simmer to full boil. People started unbuckling their seatbelts. Others were yelling questions nobody could answer. The SEALs were on their feet, scanning for some kind of authority figure to take charge. But the flight crew looked just as lost as everyone else. And in row 12, Thomas Ward opened his eyes, not with a start, not with confusion or fear, just opened them, calm and clear and completely alert, like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. He removed his white gloves, one finger at a time, tucked them neatly into his inner pocket, and reached up for the oxygen mask dangling above his head. But he didn't put it on, just held it, watching, studying, taking inventory of a situation that was spiraling toward disaster. A flight attendant sprinted past him, nearly tripping over her own feet as she grabbed for the intercom handset. "Flight 209, requesting immediate assistance to cockpit. Medical emergency forward." Static answered her, nothing but electronic noise. In the row ahead, Brant was standing now, his face pale as milk. "What the hell is happening?" One of his teammates was already pulling down his mask. "That wasn't turbulence, something just blew out." From the back of the plane, "The lights are dead back here." Then the cockpit door burst open. Captain Ellis Kane staggered into the aisle, sweat-soaked and pale, one hand gripping the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His uniform was wrinkled, his face was the colour of old newspaper, and when he opened his mouth, his voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "I need a pilot now!" The words echoed down the entire length of the aircraft. 200 people turned to look, waiting for someone, anyone, to stand up and save them. The silence that followed was maybe the most terrifying thing yet, but the only person who moved was the man in the red coat in row 12. The quiet after Captain Kane's shout was deafening. Passengers frozen mid-panic, oxygen masks swaying, everyone looking around like maybe they'd missed something. Surely someone would stand up. Surely there was a pilot somewhere in this flying tube full of people. But nobody moved, except Brant, who pushed himself up out of his seat, all that earlier swagger replaced by something that looked suspiciously like fear. "What do you mean, you need a pilot?" he demanded, like Kane was personally responsible for ruining his evening. Kane didn't have time for explanations. His eyes were scanning the cabin desperately, searching for a raised hand, a voice, any sign that someone could help him land 200 souls safely. "Co-pilot's unconscious. Systems are failing. I need someone with flight experience, right now." A beat, then another. Nobody spoke. Brant turned to his team. "Johnson, you flew birds in Iraq, right?" Johnson shook his head. "Helicopters, not jets, and definitely not at 7 miles up." Kane's face was going from pale to grey. "I don't have time to teach anyone. We're losing fuel pressure, and the autopilot's intermittent at best. If someone doesn't help me in the next 60 seconds... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. That's when row 12 stirred. Thomas Ward rose from his seat, like he was stepping onto the parade ground at Buckingham Palace. Smooth, deliberate, no wasted motion. He straightened his tunic with one hand and stepped into the aisle. For a moment, the only sound was the plane's struggling engines. Then Brandt saw him and actually laughed. "You have got to be kidding me." Ward walked toward the cockpit with that same measured pace he'd used boarding the plane. When he reached Kane, he stopped and met the captain's eyes. "I can fly," he said simply. The captain looked at him, really looked, taking in the uniform, the bearing, the absolute calm in the middle of chaos. "Do you have experience with commercial aircraft?" "Fixed wing and rotary, combat conditions, I can get us down." Brandt stepped into the aisle, arms spread wide like he was stopping traffic. "Hold on! You're seriously going to let this guy fly the plane? You don't even know who he is." Kane's voice was steady steel. "I know he's the only one who stood up." "But he's just—" Brandt gestured helplessly at Ward's uniform. "He's ceremonial. These guys are for show. They don't actually do anything. You want to bet 200 lives on someone whose biggest challenge is standing still for tourists?" Ward didn't argue, didn't defend himself, just looked at Brandt with the kind of calm that comes from having nothing left to prove. "I don't need your approval," he said quietly, "just a clear path." Kane stepped between them. "Unless one of you is rated for emergency procedures on a twin-engine airliner with partial system failure, sit down and let me work." Brandt's mouth opened and closed, like he was drowning in his own disbelief. Behind him, his teammates were looking anywhere but at their leader's face. One of them quietly dropped back into his seat. Ward sidestepped Brandt and continued toward the cockpit. The aisle cleared like magic. People who had been paralyzed with fear suddenly found enough sense to get out of the way. Someone in the middle of the plane was recording with their phone. Others just watched in stunned silence as the man they'd been ignoring walked toward the front of the aircraft like he'd been planning this his entire life. Kane fell into step beside Ward. "What's your name?" "Corporal Thomas Ward." "British Army?" "Coldstream Guards, former 2 para." Kane glanced at him sideways. "You've done this before." "Chinook helicopter, Helmand Province. Pilot died mid-flight. I brought her down in a sandstorm with half the tail section missing." Kane nodded once, the kind of nod soldiers give when they recognize their own kind. "That'll work." They reached the cockpit door, hanging open like a mouth gasping for air. Kane stopped and turned to face Ward. "Here's what we've got. Co-pilot's unconscious. Might be a seizure, might be a heart attack, but he's not coming back. I've got complete instrument failure on the port side. Hydraulics are sluggish. And I'm flying half-blind on engine 2. I can keep us level, but I can't bring us down alone." Ward absorbed the information like he was receiving orders for guard duty. No drama, no panic, just professional assessment. Manual override functional. Negative? Fuel balance? Sporadic. Then we've got about 40 minutes to work a miracle. Kane studied his face. Not the uniform, not the ribbons, not the polished image everyone else saw, but the man underneath. And for the first time since the alarm started, he felt something that might have been hope. "After you, Corporal." Ward stepped into the cockpit without hesitation, settling into the co-pilot's seat like he'd been doing it his whole life. The unconscious co-pilot had been moved to the small jump seat behind them, still breathing but completely out of the fight. The cockpit looked like a Christmas tree designed by someone having a nightmare. Red lights blinked everywhere. Screens flickered with error messages. Alarms wailed in rotating patterns that were supposed to grab attention, but now just added to the chaos. Smoke was curling from a ventilation panel, the plastic edge blackened where something had overheated and died. Kane was already strapped into the left seat, his hands white-knuckled on the yoke. "I've got engine 2 running rough. Temperature spikes on the ICAS display, but I think it's a sensor fault." Ward's eyes moved across the instrument panel with surgical precision. No wasted motion, no hesitation. He reached for a secondary display, bypassed the primary nav system, and brought up the cross-feed diagnostics. "Kill the temperature alarm," he said calmly. "Your sensor's feeding you garbage data. Cross-check on the backup system. If the readings don't match, ignore the computer and trust the engine." Kane flipped the override. The piercing alarm died, and suddenly the cockpit felt slightly less like the inside of a tornado. Ward's fingers danced across the controls, each movement deliberate and sure. "There, your left engine's running clean. The computer's just confused. You throttle back now and you'll lose lift. We need every pound of thrust we can get. Kane blinked. How can you tell? Vibration patterns wrong for thermal stress. This is electrical interference, not mechanical failure. Ward adjusted something else, and the plane's subtle yaw began to smooth out. Your fuel system's fighting you too. Manual balance controls should still respond. He flipped open a side panel, studied the analog gauges that didn't depend on computers, then started making minute adjustments. The plane's handling immediately improved. Kane was staring at him now. Where'd you learn to read systems like that? Afghanistan. When everything's trying to kill you, you learn to listen to what machines are really saying. Ward's hands never stopped moving, constantly fine-tuning their flight path. We're heavy and we're running out of time. I need you to get us clearance for Iceland. Keflavik's got the longest runway and the best crash equipment. Kane keyed the radio. Reykjavik Control, Flight 209 declaring emergency. Dual crew incapacitation. Acting co-pilot is military with combat flight experience. Requesting priority approach and emergency services. Static filled the cockpit for what felt like forever. Then, Flight 209, this is Reykjavik. You are cleared for emergency approach. Continue current heading. Emergency services are being notified. Kane turned to Ward. They just cleared a Royal Guard to land a commercial airliner. Ward allowed himself the faintest smile. Wouldn't be the strangest thing I've done in uniform. Outside the cockpit windows, the North Atlantic stretched endlessly in all directions, black water under a ceiling of clouds that looked like concrete. But somewhere ahead, Iceland's lights were growing brighter, and for the first time since the crisis started, their aircraft felt less like a falling brick and more like something that might actually make it to the ground in one piece. Ward's hands moved constantly across the controls, adjusting, compensating, coaxing the wounded aircraft towards safety with the kind of skill that only comes from having done the impossible before. Behind the cockpit door, 200 people were trusting their lives to a man they'd barely noticed when he boarded. But in the narrow space, filled with warning lights and the smell of overheated electronics, Thomas Ward was exactly where he belonged. The approach to Keflavik was like threading a needle in a hurricane. Wind slammed the aircraft from every direction, ice crystals pelted the windscreen, and the runway lights appeared and disappeared behind sheets of freezing rain that made visibility almost zero. Ward's voice stayed level through it all. Reykjavik Control, Flight 209, we're coming in hot with partial hydraulics. Request emergency vehicles positioned for possible overrun. Copy that, 209. Winds gusting to 25 knots. Visibility 1 mile. You are cleared to land. Kane's knuckles were white on the yoke. I can barely see the approach lights. I've got them, Ward said, his eyes locked on the faint glow ahead. Gear down on my mark. Manual extension. Don't trust the hydraulics. The landing gear groaned like it was in pain, but the 3 green lights finally appeared on the panel. Ward studied the readings, made another adjustment to their angle of descent. We're coming in steep, Kane warned. Better than coming in sideways, Ward replied. Flaps to landing position. When I say cut power, cut it completely. The runway rushed toward them through the storm, growing larger by the second. Ward's hands moved across the controls with the precision of a surgeon, making tiny corrections that kept them lined up with the center line despite the crosswind trying to push them off course. 50 feet, Kane called. I see it. Power off. Now. Kane pulled the throttles back. The plane dropped like a stone. They hit hard. The landing gear slammed into concrete with a sound like artillery fire. The aircraft bounced once, then again, the entire airframe shuddering under the impact. In the cabin behind them, someone screamed. Overhead, bins popped open. A suitcase went flying. Ward worked the rudder pedals, fighting to keep them straight as the plane skidded sideways on the icy runway. Sparks flew from the brakes. The nose pitched down alarmingly. For a terrifying moment, it felt like they might cartwheel end over end. But Ward's hands were steady on the controls, making constant corrections, never fighting the plane, but working with it, coaxing it to stay upright and pointed in the right direction. The screaming brakes finally began to bite. The aircraft slowed, still sliding but under control now. Slower. slower. And then they stopped. Complete silence, except for the tick of cooling metal and the drum of rain against aluminum skin. Kane sat back in his seat, his whole body shaking. Jesus Christ. Ward calmly began shutting down systems, his movements as precise as they'd been during the crisis. Emergency crews will want to check the gear before we taxi. Might be a few minutes. Kane turned to look at him, this man who'd just saved 200 lives while wearing a ceremonial uniform. What did you do before the guards? Paratrooper. 2 tours in Afghanistan. And before that? Ward allowed himself a small smile. Learned to fly in my father's crop duster when I was 16. He always said you never know when you might need to bring something down safely. Behind them, the cabin erupted in applause and sobbing, and the kind of laughter that comes when people realize they're still alive when they probably shouldn't be. But Ward was already unbuckling his harness, preparing to return to his seat like nothing had happened. Just another day's work for a man who'd spent his career standing ready for moments when everything went wrong. Kane grabbed his arm as he stood. That was extraordinary flying. Ward straightened his tunic and adjusted his collar. That was just flying, sir. The extraordinary part was having passengers who trusted me to do it. And with that, he opened the cockpit door and stepped back into a cabin full of people who would never look at a ceremonial uniform the same way again. The cockpit door opened to reveal something that would stay burned in Captain Kane's memory forever. Hundreds of faces turned toward him with expressions of disbelief, gratitude, and pure relief. Some people were crying, others were laughing. A few looked like they weren't entirely sure they were still alive. Then Thomas Ward stepped out behind him, still in his scarlet tunic, still perfectly pressed, still looking like he'd just stepped off guard duty at Buckingham Palace, instead of out of the cockpit of a crippled airliner. The applause started slowly, one person clapping, then 2, then spreading like wildfire from the back of the plane to the front. But it wasn't the polite golf clap kind of applause. This was raw, emotional, the sound of people who had looked death in the face and lived to tell about it. Some passengers stood up. Others reached out to touch his arm as he passed. A flight attendant was openly weeping, pressing her hand to her heart. And then there were the SEALs. Brandt was still in his seat, hunched forward with his head in his hands. When Ward walked past his row, Brandt looked up, and his face was a study in shame. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, maybe an apology, maybe just acknowledgement of how wrong he'd been. But Ward didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't give him the satisfaction of even making eye contact. He just walked back to 12A, sat down, and calmly closed his eyes, like it was just another day at the office. A small voice broke the spell. "Excuse me?" Ward opened one eye. A kid was standing in the aisle, maybe 8 years old, freckles scattered across his nose, still clutching a travel pillow like a security blanket. "Are you a real hero?" Ward's expression softened slightly. "No, son. Just a soldier who happened to know how to fly." The boy beamed like he'd just met Superman. "That's the coolest thing ever." And somehow, despite everything they'd just been through, Ward smiled back. Around them, the plane was still buzzing with conversation, with people trying to process what had just happened. Emergency vehicles were pulling up outside the windows, their lights flashing across the ice. In a few minutes, they'd all be evacuated, debriefed, and sent on their way. But for now, they were just grateful to be on the ground, and every single one of them knew exactly who they had to thank for that. The man in the red uniform who'd been invisible when they boarded, and indispensable when everything went wrong. Would you have trusted the guy in the ceremonial uniform when the pilot collapsed? Think you could have stayed that calm with 200 lives depending on your next decision? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you know. If this story reminded you that real capability doesn't always announce itself, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Share this with someone who knows what it really means to be ready when nobody's watching. More stories about the quiet professionals who keep us safe are waiting right here on your screen. Click one now, and I'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that the most dangerous person in the room is usually the one nobody notices. Until then, remember, Sometimes the person you underestimate is exactly the person you need most.